The bank manager's voice on the phone sounded uncertain, like she was reading words that didn't make sense even to her. Marcus had answered on the third ring, his hands still wet from washing dishes in his small apartment kitchen. He thought it was about the debt. It was always about the debt. 17 years of collection calls, payment plans that fell through, extension requests, and the slow, grinding realization that some holes are too deep to climb out of alone. But this call was different. This call was going to change what he understood about invisible things. Mr. Chen, I'm calling because we've had an account holder who's been making consistent deposits for 7 years, and the total has just reached exactly $300,000. The account is registered under Emma Chen, and she's indicated that you should know about it. She wants you to call her when you're ready. Marcus sat down on the kitchen floor without meaning to. His legs simply stopped supporting him. The phone stayed pressed to his ear, but he couldn't speak. The manager continued, her voice gentle now because she'd learned long ago that some moments need space. She gave him the account number. She told him the deposits had been made every single week without fail. She said his daughter had come into the branch in person last Tuesday and sat across from a loan officer and asked for documentation of the total. She had watched the number climb to exactly what was owed, waited for that moment with what the manager described as remarkable patience for someone her age, and then made the final deposit herself. Marcus was 47 years old. He had been carrying this weight since before Emma was born. He had structured his entire life around it, the jobs he took, the hours he worked, the things he didn't buy, the places he didn't go, the dreams he postponed. He had done it without ever saying a word, or so he thought. He had done it believing that silence was protection, that his sacrifice was his alone to carry. But for 7 years, someone had been watching. The debt had started long before Emma existed. Marcus remembers the exact moment he signed the papers, the exact moment he believed he was becoming an entrepreneur, the exact moment he became someone who would carry a weight for the next 2 decades. It was 1998. He was 25 years old. He had just finished his degree in linguistics and translation, and he was restless in a way that only young men with options tend to be restless. He wanted to build something. He wanted to matter. He wanted to look back at his life 10 years later and feel like he'd done more than just exist. He met David Chen at a networking event. This David Chen, no relation, though the coincidence of their last names made them laugh about it later, before the laughing stopped. David had the kind of confidence that convinces people. He had a business plan that seemed airtight. He had already secured some initial funding. What he needed was someone who understood languages, someone who could handle international logistics, someone with Marcus's particular combination of attention to detail and willingness to work. "We're going to import specialty goods from Asia," David had explained, and his eyes had been bright with the kind of certainty that only comes when you haven't yet failed at anything. High-end furniture, textiles, home goods, items that are too niche for the big box stores but that have real markets here. We'll create a brand. We'll build a reputation. In 5 years, we'll be in every upscale home in the city. Marcus had believed him. Or maybe he'd believed in the version of himself that David was describing. The version who wasn't just translating other people's documents, but building something of his own. So he had liquidated his savings. He had taken out a business loan. He had borrowed money from his parents, who had argued against it but ultimately couldn't deny their son's earnest conviction that he was on to something real. For 14 months, it looked like David had been right. They secured a warehouse. They established relationships with suppliers in Taiwan and Vietnam. They imported the first shipment: hand-carved wooden screens, silk cushions, ceramic vases with the kind of glazework that took months to perfect. They created a showroom in a converted loft in the Arts District. They threw a launch party. For 2 weeks, they were the story that people told at dinner parties. These young guys doing something interesting, building something real. Then David disappeared. Not dramatically. There was no final confrontation, no angry email, no theatrical resignation. He simply didn't show up to the office one Monday morning. By Wednesday, when Marcus finally went to David's apartment, he found it empty. By Thursday, when Marcus checked their business accounts, he found that the majority of the remaining inventory, The pieces that were supposed to be in their second shipment had been transferred out under David's authorization. By Friday, Marcus had learned that David Chen had moved to Portland and opened another import business, and that he'd taken approximately 40% of their initial investment capital with him. Marcus was 26 years old. He was holding a $300,000 debt that had been accumulated through a partnership that no longer existed. The inventory in their warehouse was worth maybe half of what they owed. The business licenses were still in both their names, which meant that legally, Marcus was fully responsible for the entire debt, whether David ever paid a penny or not. The bank didn't care that he'd been betrayed. The creditors didn't care that he'd been naive. The only thing that mattered was that someone needed to pay and that someone was Marcus. He could have declared bankruptcy. He could have walked away. Plenty of people in his position would have. But Marcus had been raised with a particular set of values by parents who had immigrated to this country with almost nothing and had built a life through work and integrity. His mother had worked as a seamstress. His father had worked in restaurant kitchens. They had taught him that your word was the only thing that truly belonged to you, and that once you gave it away, you couldn't take it back. So when Marcus looked at his situation, he didn't see an opportunity to escape. He saw a responsibility that he had to fulfill, regardless of how long it took or what it cost him. He liquidated what was left of the business. He sold the inventory piece by piece, mostly at a loss, but getting whatever he could. He consolidated the debt. He created a plan. He was going to pay back $300,000, every single penny, even if it took him the rest of his adult life. He was going to do it because he had signed documents that said he would, and because he was the kind of person who kept promises, even when those promises became incredibly expensive. So he went to work. He got a job at a translation company, a real job, a stable job, something that paid decently and offered health insurance. He worked there 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Then he got a second job translating documents independently in the evenings, picking up work through a network of law firms and medical offices that needed someone who could handle complex documents with precision. He worked that job 4 hours a night, 4 nights a week. Then he got a third job, weekend work at a hospitality company, translating for clients who needed someone to bridge language gaps. He would work Saturday and Sunday mornings, usually 4 to 6 hours each day. This became his life. This became the shape of him. He was 26 years old, and he had already decided that the next 20 years would be structured around paying back a debt that a man named David Chen had helped him accumulate. Then he met Elena. She was a client at the translation company. She came in needing help with a visa application, and Marcus was assigned to work with her. She was beautiful in the way that some people are beautiful not because of their features, but because of the way they move through the world, with intention, with clarity, with a kind of presence that made people want to be around her. She was originally from Colombia. She had come to the country on her own, worked multiple jobs, and was now trying to bring her mother over to live with her. Marcus had helped her with the translation, and then he had helped her with other things. He had gone out with her for coffee, and then dinner, and then he had found himself doing something that he thought he'd decided against. He had found himself falling in love. Elena knew about the debt from the beginning. Marcus had told her because he believed in honesty, and because he wanted her to understand what she was getting into if she got into anything with him. She had listened to the whole story. The failed business, the betrayal, the 3 jobs, the plan to spend the next 2 decades paying back money that wasn't entirely his fault. And then she had said something that Marcus never forgot. That's a lot of weight to carry alone. He had married Elena 18 months later. He had done it knowing that he was bringing her into a life of financial constraint, that they would never have the kind of financial freedom that other couples had, that vacations and new cars and the casual consumption that most people took for granted would not be available to them. Elena had agreed anyway. She had said that she loved him, and that love meant being willing to carry some of the weight with him. Emma was born when Marcus was 28 years old. She came into the world on a Tuesday morning in March, and when the nurse placed her in Marcus's arms, he felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't quite name. It was joy, yes, but it was also terror, because now there was a person in the world who was entirely dependent on him, And he was a man carrying a debt that would take another 17 years to pay off. A man who was already stretched thin across 3 different jobs. A man who was running on very little sleep and even less hope. He had looked at his daughter's face, so small, so perfect, so trusting, and he had made a silent promise to her. He had promised that he would figure out how to be both the man who paid his debts and the father who showed up for his child. He didn't know how he would do it, but he would do it, because that was the kind of man he was. Elena had been wonderful through all of it. She had taken the early mornings with Emma while Marcus slept a few hours before his first job. She had worked her own job as a nurse, and she had come home and had taken over childcare so that Marcus could go to his evening translation work. They had barely seen each other during the week, but they had made it work, because the alternative was not working, and not working was not an option. Their relationship had become a practical partnership in survival, and there was a kind of beauty in that, even if it wasn't the kind of marriage they had imagined when they were falling in love. But then, when Emma was 4 years old, Elena had sat Marcus down and told him that she couldn't do it anymore. Not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't watch him slowly disappear under the weight of a debt that he had taken on before she even knew him. She had said that she loved him, but that she loved herself too, and that staying in this marriage meant signing up for a life that was always going to be defined by financial crisis and exhaustion. She had said that she wanted to be someone's first priority, not someone's second priority after money. And Marcus couldn't argue with her because she was right. They had gotten divorced amicably. Elena had gotten primary custody of Emma. Marcus had been given visitation rights every other weekend and 2 weeks in the summer. They had worked out a child support arrangement that was lower than it might have been because Elena understood that Marcus was already carrying an enormous load. And then Elena had found someone else, a man named Robert who had a stable job and no debts and who could give her the kind of life that Marcus couldn't. And Marcus had been happy for her, in the way that you can be happy for someone you love while also grieving what you've lost. So Marcus's life had been reshaped again. He had his apartment, which was small and rented. He had his 3 jobs. He had Emma every other weekend, and he had spent those weekends trying to cram the entire experience of fatherhood into 48 hours. He had taken her to parks. He had made her favorite foods. He had helped her with homework. He had done all the things that fathers do, but always with the awareness that he was doing it on borrowed time, that in 48 hours she would go back to her mother's house and Robert's house, where there was more stability and more money and more of everything except Marcus. This was his life at 47. This was the shape that the debt had forced him into, and he had accepted it, because it was the consequence of his choices, and he believed that you had to live with the consequences of your choices. What he didn't know was that Emma had been studying him this entire time. It started when Emma was 11 years old. This was the year that something shifted in her understanding of her father. She was old enough now to understand concepts like debt and failure and financial struggle. She was old enough to read the stress on her father's face. She was old enough to notice that he never asked for anything for himself, that he was always looking at price tags, that there were entire categories of experience that seemed to be off limits to him. Marcus came to pick her up on a Friday afternoon. He was tired. He was always tired now, running on coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from having no other option. Emma had noticed that he'd fallen asleep during the movie they were watching the night before. She had noticed that he'd been wearing the same shirt for 3 days in a row. She had noticed that when they'd gone to get ice cream, he'd gotten her a cone, but had declined to get anything for himself, saying that he wasn't hungry, even though she could hear his stomach growling. On Saturday morning, while they were eating breakfast, cereal and toast, the kind of breakfast that you eat when money is tight but you want to pretend that you're not thinking about money being tight, Emma had asked him a question. "Dad, do you have enough money?" It was the kind of question that only a child could ask with such directness. An adult would have hemmed and hawed. An adult would have said something about managing or getting by. But Emma was 11 and she didn't yet know how to soften her questions or cushion her concerns. Marcus had looked at her for a long moment. He could have lied. He could have said yes, everything is fine, don't worry about it. He could have protected her the way he had always tried to protect her. But something in her face, some combination of seriousness and care, made him decide to tell her the truth. "No," he had said. "Not really. I have enough to take care of you and to pay for my apartment and to keep paying towards some debts that I have. But I don't have extra money for things like vacations or new things or the kind of life that other kids get to live. I'm sorry about that." Emma had considered this for a long moment. She was eating her cereal slowly, thinking about something. And then she had asked another question. "Can you give me $1 every week?" Marcus had been confused by this. $1? He'd asked. "Why? Just can you?" Emma had pressed. "Every week, without asking what it's for." The request was so specific, so deliberate, that it pulled him out of his confusion. He had looked at his daughter, 11 years old, wearing her school uniform, her hair still wet from shower, her eyes absolutely serious. And he had recognized something in that seriousness. He had recognized the same kind of determination that he felt in himself, the determination to do something that mattered, even if nobody else understood why. "Yes," he'd said, "every week. I promise." Emma had nodded, satisfied. She had gone back to her cereal. And Marcus had sat there wondering what his daughter was planning, what she understood, what she was trying to do. But he had also respected her privacy. He had decided that if she wanted to tell him, she would. And if she didn't, then that was her right. So the ritual began. Every week, on some day, sometimes Sunday morning, sometimes Thursday night, sometimes Wednesday morning before school, Emma would ask him for $1, and Marcus would give it to her. He would pull out his wallet, and he would hand her a single bill, and she would take it with the seriousness of someone making a transaction that mattered. He started to notice patterns. She never asked twice in a single day. She never forgot to ask. If he went out and forgot to make sure he had cash, she would remind him. The $1-a-week request was treated with the kind of respect that most people reserve for important obligations. Sometimes Marcus would try to ask what she was doing with the money, and Emma would simply shake her head. "It's something I need to do," she would say, and he would accept that answer, because he had learned long ago that children had their own logic, their own reasons for things, and that sometimes the best thing a parent could do was trust that logic without demanding to understand it. By the time Emma turned 12, Marcus had been giving her $1 every week for almost a year. That was roughly $52. He tried to imagine what she might be saving for. A bike? Some kind of electronic device? Her mother had mentioned that Emma's tastes seemed to be getting more expensive as she got older, as they did with all teenagers. But nothing he imagined quite fit with the gravity that Emma treated the dollar asking with. He was at a law firm one day, translating a complex contract when one of the paralegals mentioned in passing that she'd seen Emma at the bank. The paralegal had recognized her because she'd come into the office with Marcus before, and she'd said something like, "Your daughter came into the bank on Saturday. She deposited some cash. She looked very serious about it." Marcus had been surprised. He hadn't known that Emma went to the bank. He hadn't realized that she was actually doing something tangible with the dollars, not just collecting them or hiding them under her mattress. But again, he had decided not to ask. If Emma was banking the money, then she had a plan. And if she had a plan, then his job was to trust her. Over the next year, as Emma moved from age 12 to 13, Marcus began to understand, in a vague way, that his daughter was saving for something. The $1-a-week request continued, and he began to notice small details that he hadn't paid attention to before. The way that she seemed to track his stress levels, the way that she would sometimes sit with him in silence when he seemed particularly worried, the way that she had started asking him questions about his debt. "How much do you owe?" she'd asked once casually, while they were watching a movie. $300,000, he'd said. It was not a number he usually said out loud. It was a number that lived in the back of his mind, a constant weight that he tried not to think about too directly. "How much have you paid back?" she'd asked. "Maybe 40 or 50,000, he'd said. "It's hard to know exactly because I'm also paying interest, which means the total goes down slower than it should." Emma had nodded, like this information was important. And then she'd gone back to watching the movie, and Marcus had gone back to trying not to think about the 17 years of debt repayment that still stretched ahead of him. By the time Emma turned 14, her mother Elena had called Marcus to tell him something. She'd said that Emma had been acting differently, more serious, more withdrawn. Elena had been worried that maybe Emma was having problems at school, or that she was struggling with depression, or that there was something else going on. Elena had suggested that Marcus talk to her about it, see if she would open up to him about what was bothering her. So one Saturday, while Emma was at his apartment, Marcus had asked her if everything was okay. He'd said that her mother was worried about her, that she seemed different lately. Emma had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had said, "I'm fine. I'm just focused on something." "What are you focused on?" Marcus had asked. "I can't tell you yet," Emma had said, "but I will. Eventually. I promise." This was all the answer he was going to get. So Marcus had accepted it, and he had continued to give her $1 every week, and he had continued to wonder what she was doing, and he had continued to carry his debt, unaware that someone else in the world was carrying it with him. The years passed with a kind of monotonous persistence. Marcus turned 40, Emma turned 15. The debt remained, a constant presence in both their lives, though they experienced it in completely different ways. Marcus was living in the weight of it, the reality of it, the day-to-day exhaustion of it, the way it had shaped every decision he had ever made. Emma was living with the awareness of it, carrying it not as a burden but as a problem to be solved, a puzzle that required patience and strategy. When Emma turned 16, she asked her father if they could go to the bank together. It was an unusual request. Marcus couldn't imagine why she would want to go to the bank with him, but he had learned not to question her by now, so they went to the bank together on a Saturday morning, and Emma led him to a bank manager's office and she asked to speak to the manager alone. Marcus sat in the waiting area for about 15 minutes. He could see through the glass walls as Emma talked to the manager, her face serious and focused. And then they were done and Emma came back out and she said, "Okay, let's go." "What was that about?" he asked as they left the bank. "Can't tell you yet," she said, and then she asked for her $1, right there in the bank lobby as if nothing unusual had just happened. Marcus gave it to her. He always gave it to her. By the time Emma turned 17, Marcus had started to notice something different. The dollar asking had taken on a different quality. It seemed more urgent somehow. Emma would still ask with the same seriousness, but there was an anticipatory quality to it now, like she was counting down toward something. She had started asking him more specific questions about his debt again. She'd asked him if the total amount owed had changed. She'd asked him if there was any way to pay it off more quickly. She'd asked him what his life would be like if the debt was suddenly gone. "I don't know," Marcus had answered honestly to that last question. "I've been carrying this for so long that I don't really remember what life was like before it. It's hard to imagine life without it." Emma had nodded like this was important information. And then she had asked for her $1. The pattern had become so familiar that Marcus had stopped questioning it. Every week, Emma asked for $1. Every week, he gave it to her. It was a ritual between them, one of the few constant things in their lives, one of the few moments where they came together in a transaction that seemed to matter more than its surface appearance suggested. Emma turned 18 in March. By June, she had graduated from high school. She had been accepted to university with a full scholarship, the kind of scholarship that made Marcus proud in a way that was almost painful. His daughter was going to have the kind of opportunities that he had never had. She was going to escape the kind of financial constraint that had defined his adult life. And then, on a Tuesday in late June, the bank manager called. Marcus had answered on the third ring, his hands still wet from washing dishes. He had thought it was about the debt. It was always about the debt, but this time it was something else entirely. "Mr. Chen, I'm calling because we've had an account holder who's been making consistent deposits for 7 years, and the total has just reached exactly $300,000. Exactly. That was the word that made it click. Exactly $300,000. The precise amount that Marcus owed. The precise amount that he had been struggling to pay back for 17 years. Emma had done the math. Emma had calculated, down to the dollar, exactly how long it would take for weekly deposits to accumulate to $300,000. And then she had spent 7 years making sure that those deposits happened exactly on schedule. The account is registered under Emma Chen, and she's indicated that you should know about it. She wants you to call her when you're ready. Marcus sat on the kitchen floor. His legs had stopped working. His mind had stopped working. All he could do was sit there and try to understand what his daughter had been doing for 7 years while he thought she was just being a kid, while he thought she was protected from his struggle, while he thought his sacrifice was invisible. The bank manager was speaking. She was giving him information about the account. She was telling him that Emma had come in person last Tuesday and made the final deposit herself. She was telling him that Emma's patience, her consistency, her 7-year dedication to a plan that no one else in the world knew about, was the most remarkable thing she'd witnessed in 20 years of working at a bank. She seemed very calm about it, the manager was saying, like she'd always known it would work out exactly this way, like she'd planned it all along. Because she had. Emma had planned it all along. She had figured out the math. She had calculated the timeline. She had made a decision at 11 years old to help her father carry his burden in the only way that she could, by taking the dollars he gave her and transforming them into something that could actually change his life. Marcus called her number, but it went to voicemail. So he hung up and waited, sitting on the kitchen floor, trying to make sense of the fact that his daughter had spent 7 years building a path out of the darkness that he'd been living in. When Emma called back, her voice sounded like it always did, calm, certain, the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Emma," he said, "I got a call from the bank." "I know," she said. "I told them to call you." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Not accusatory, just confused, like he was trying to understand the rules of a game that he hadn't known he was playing. "Because you would have told me to stop," she said simply. "You would have said that you couldn't take money from me, that I needed to save it for college, that it was too much of a burden. And I would have listened, because I always listen to you. But this was something I needed to do. Not because I thought you couldn't figure it out on your own, but because I wanted you to know that I was paying attention." Marcus found that he couldn't speak. The words were somewhere in his chest, but they couldn't make it to his mouth. "I know the debt isn't completely paid off yet," Emma continued. Her voice had the kind of steadiness that comes from having thought about this conversation many times before. "I know I only saved $300,000, and that doesn't include the interest that's accrued over the years. But the bank manager said that with what I've saved plus what you could probably earn in the next few months if you focused on it, the debt could be completely gone by the end of the summer. That was always the plan. That was always going to be the plan." "Emma," he said, "that's your money. That's your future. Your education." "No," she said, and her voice had a firmness to it that made him remember suddenly that his little girl was not a little girl anymore. She was 18 years old. She was an adult. She had been paying attention for 7 years while he thought she was oblivious. "It's yours. It's your freedom. And I earned it, Dad. I worked for it. I deposited $1 every single week for 7 years. I didn't miss once. Not once. That wasn't you doing anything for me. That was me doing something for you. That was me saying that I see you. I see what you're carrying. I'm going to carry it with you." Marcus found that he was crying now. He was crying on his kitchen floor, holding a phone to his ear, listening to his daughter explain that she had spent 7 years of her life bearing witness to his struggle, and that she had done it with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return, but that also insists on being acknowledged. "I've been watching you my whole life," Emma said. Her voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it, carefully controlled. "I've watched you work 3 jobs. I've watched you give up things that you wanted so that I could have what I needed. I've watched you carry something that wasn't your fault with a kind of grace that most people don't have. And I wanted you to know that it wasn't invisible. It wasn't invisible to me. Every single week when I asked you for that $1, I was saying something. I was saying, I see you. I'm paying attention. You matter." When you finish paying off the debt, Emma continued, what are you going to do? Like, with your time, with your life? What are you going to do when you're not spending every hour trying to pay back someone else's betrayal? Marcus had never asked himself this question. The debt had been his structure, his shape, his defining characteristic for so long that he had forgotten there was anything else. He had forgotten to imagine a version of himself that wasn't drowning. I don't know, he said truthfully. Maybe you could figure that out, Emma said. Maybe once the debt is paid, you could take some time off, or take a job that you actually like instead of just taking jobs that pay. Maybe you could travel. Maybe you could remember what it feels like to want something for yourself instead of just wanting to not owe money. The generosity of this vision, the way that Emma was trying to give him not just freedom from debt, but freedom toward something, toward a future that included things he wanted rather than just things he needed, was almost more than Marcus could bear. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You don't have to, Emma said. I did it because I love you, and because I wanted you to know that I see you. I've always seen you. For 7 years, every time I asked you for that dollar, I was saying, I see what you're carrying, I'm paying attention. You're not invisible to me. You were never invisible to me. The weeks that followed were a blur of practical action and emotional processing. Marcus and Emma worked together to understand the account. They spoke with a bank manager who explained the options. With Emma's $300,000 as a starting point, Marcus would only need to earn about $20,000 more to completely clear the debt. At his current rate, working his 3 jobs, that would take roughly 3 to 4 months of focused effort. 3 to 4 months. After 17 years of carrying this weight, Marcus would be free in the matter of a few months. Emma insisted that Marcus take her money to the bank and combine it with his own small savings. She insisted that he start the process of paying off the debt immediately. She insisted that he not wait, not delay, not second-guess the gift that she had given him. You've waited long enough, she told him. Let me help you stop waiting. So Marcus began the process. He worked his 3 jobs with a new sense of purpose, a new understanding that there was actually a finish line now, that the weight he'd been carrying was finally going to be set down. He started paying down the debt with Emma's savings and his own earnings. He kept detailed records of every payment. He watched the number get smaller, 300,000 becoming 290,000, becoming 280,000. By August, the final payment was made. Marcus walked into the bank with Emma and they met with the loan officer, and they made the final deposit that cleared the slate. The debt was gone. The weight was gone. The thing that had defined Marcus's adult life for the past 17 years was finally, completely, absolutely gone. The bank manager brought them to her office, and she congratulated them both. She told Emma that she had never seen anything quite like what she had done. She told Marcus that he had raised an exceptional daughter, and then she gave them both a copy of the paperwork, confirming that the debt had been paid in full. Marcus held the paperwork in his hands and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't joy exactly. It was more like the absence of something, the absence of weight, the absence of pressure, the absence of the constant low-level panic that had been with him for so long that he'd almost forgotten it was there. Emma hugged him, and he held his daughter, and for the first time in 17 years, Marcus allowed himself to believe that he might actually be free. But that wasn't really what changed. What changed was understanding that he had never been carrying it alone. What changed was realizing that the person he was trying to protect was the person who had been protecting him all along. What changed was knowing that his sacrifice had not gone unseen. It had been witnessed by the person who mattered most, and that witness had been transformed into something tangible, something real, something that had the power to set him free. Marcus took his first real vacation in a decade. He went to Japan. He had always wanted to go to Japan. The language, the culture, the way that the written characters themselves were like art. He spent 2 weeks there, and he visited temples, and he ate food that he didn't have to calculate the cost of, and he sat in parks and read books. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was actually living instead of just surviving. Emma went to university that fall with her scholarship intact and her heart lighter. Because she had finally completed what she had set out to do 7 years earlier. She studied international relations and psychology. She wanted to understand how systems of power worked and how individuals could create change within those systems. She wanted in many ways to extend the lesson she'd learned from her father, that patience, consistency, and bearing witness could have more power than dramatic action. Marcus kept his job at the translation firm, but he made a change. He stopped taking the evening and weekend jobs. For the first time in 17 years, he had evenings that were his own. He had weekends that were free. He had time to read, to think, to exist, as something other than a man in the process of paying a debt. He started volunteering with an organization that helped newly arrived immigrants navigate legal documents and processes. He was good at it, and it felt right, using his skills to help people who were in situations similar to the one he'd been in, offering them the kind of patience and understanding that had been rare in his own experience. Years later, when Emma would tell people this story, she would always start from the same place. My father spent 17 years thinking that he was invisible. He thought his sacrifice went unseen. He thought that his struggle was his alone to carry. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. Someone was always watching. And then she would describe the $1-a-week ritual. She would describe the decision she'd made at 11 years old. She would describe the 7 years of consistent deposits, the way she had mapped out the math, the way she had waited for the moment when the number would reach exactly what her father owed. And when I finally made that last deposit, she would say, I wasn't giving him money. I was giving him permission. Permission to stop carrying something alone. Permission to believe that his sacrifice mattered. Permission to have a future that wasn't defined by a past that wasn't his fault. And Marcus, when he told the story, would say something different. He would say, I thought I was the one protecting my daughter. I thought I was keeping her safe from the weight of my failure. But the whole time, she was the one protecting me. She was saying through $1 at a time that my life mattered, that my struggle wasn't invisible, that I deserved to be free. He would describe the moment when the bank manager called. He would describe sitting on the kitchen floor and trying to understand what his daughter had been doing all those years. He would describe the conversation where Emma explained that she had been paying attention, that his sacrifice had been witnessed, that love meant being willing to carry some of the weight with the person you loved. For 17 years, Marcus would say, I believed that being a good father meant protecting my child from my problems. I believed that silence was kindness. I believed that my struggle was something I had to carry alone. But Emma taught me something different. She taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is bearing witness. She taught me that invisible things can become visible if someone is patient enough and persistent enough and brave enough to pay attention. And then he would always add one more thing. She taught me that the person we try hardest to protect is often the one who's paying the closest attention to us. And that their love, their real love, is the kind that insists on being reciprocal. It's the kind that says, I see you. I see what you're carrying. Let me help you carry it. This is what it means to be truly witnessed by the people we love. It means being seen in our struggle, not to be pitied, but to be honored. It means having someone say, through patient repetition, that your sacrifice matters. It means learning that the people we try hardest to protect are often the ones who are paying the closest attention, and that their love, their real love, is the kind that insists on being reciprocal. It's the kind that acknowledges pain without trying to fix it immediately. It's the kind that says, I understand. I'm paying attention. You're not alone. The invisible becomes visible when someone is patient enough to wait for it. The sacrifice becomes meaningful when it is witnessed. The daughter becomes the father's greatest teacher about what it really means to love. And a single $1, repeated week after week for 7 years, becomes the most powerful statement of all. I see you. I'm paying attention. Your life matters. This is the story of Marcus Chen and his daughter Emma. This is the story of what happens when someone decides that the best way to help is not to rescue, but to witness. This is the story of a father who thought he was invisible, and a daughter who made it her life's work to prove him wrong. And if you're listening to this story, and you're carrying something invisible, know this: someone is watching. Maybe it's your child. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's someone you haven't even met yet. But somewhere, someone is paying attention to what you're carrying, and they're telling you, in the language of their own witness, that you matter, that your struggle matters, that you're not invisible, not even for a moment.